And we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a chat surrounding DigCiz, or digital citizenship, that's been happening during the month of June. We're into the fourth week, and every week we've had different facilitators talk about different areas and concerns and ideas and thoughts and a lot of other things surrounding this idea of digital citizenship. And this week, we have Kristen Eshelman and Bill Fitzgerald talking to us about lots of things, but things surrounding IT policies and students and our agency in these larger systems, I'll say. But I'll go ahead and hand it over to them to describe that a little bit better. So Kristen, do you want to take that away?
Sure, thanks, Cindy. Yeah, so Bill and I were tasked with this idea of addressing data and privacy through the lens of digital citizenship. So we took a stab at things that Bill is thinking about in his work with Common Sense Media, and things that I've been thinking about over the last 6 to 8 months or so around IT policy. So institutional IT, really, and what role we have in making sure those concepts of data and privacy align appropriately with digital citizenship. It's not something we've talked about deeply. We're just beginning that work at Davidson, but that's really where we started. So the post that we have out there is really looking at concepts that came out of the EDUCAUSE IT top 10 issues. And so Bill decided to tackle the one on digital transformation of learning, and I was looking at information security, mainly because I felt like the list, and I'd had this Twitter conversation with Alan at Muhlenberg and Amy Perlman at Bryn Mawr and some other folks, Dan Blickensturfer, I think I'm getting his name right, just about this concept of looking at information security from the perspective of systems and from the perspective of IT professionals, but not really thinking about it from the perspective of individual empowerment. And if we start to ask these questions in another way of our IT community, do we end up with different systems designs? And that's kind of where I'm thinking right now. And the two people that I'm really interested in following on this, in fact, one of them's here, so I'm so pleased, Amy Collier is here, and also Phil Winley at BYU. So really, Phil is looking at this concept of the university API, this concept of the personal API, and how we kind of reverse that ownership away from the institution to the individual, really getting us out of these monolithic systems that end up with these very sort of closed policies, and policies that I think really work against the kind of digital citizenship we hope we could empower, or at least somehow support and foster. And Amy is really doing amazing things around a critical look at our discipline, critical ed tech, critical instructional design. I'd love to be able to take that same approach to IT systems design and to policy design. And so I'm hoping this conversation can be really a jump start into how do we do that? How do we bring that kind of discipline to the way we think about institutional IT? And that's my intro, and I'll turn it over to Bill for his.
Well, yeah, I mean, and Kristen, I'm not going to have a whole lot to add. I mean, she accurately summarized a lot of the things we've been talking about up to now. But like, where one of the things that I've been looking at and really have more questions and answers about is, what do we change in our systems when we start from a position of learner agency at the core? And I mean, and far too often, like, the systems that we build are designed with organizations in mind and not the people using them. And as we're doing this, what are our obligations as people who are sometimes involved in building these systems, and sometimes involved in actually getting students into them? What obligations do we have to inform students and design systems in a way that lets everybody know what's actually happening with their information? And and it's kind of an interesting week to be having this this conversation, because in this week we see, well, last month we saw stories about that kind of confirmed Uber's differential pricing. So we see data and algorithms being used directly to kind of discriminate against people, and adjust prices. This is like a longstanding practice, but then we also see the RNC data leak that happened, that was announced yesterday, where we have 137 million, like 136 and change million people who voted last year, and we have data on 200 million people, including psychological profiles, all stored in one space, unencrypted, that gets breached. And these are all systems that, in order to participate in society as citizens, more or less, we don't have a choice. So what obligations do we have as educators when we are bringing people into these systems to inform them about what the risks are? And then more importantly for us, how do we actually quantify these risks and help people understand what's an acceptable risk and what's not an acceptable risk? Like, and I don't have answers, but I would love to hear the people who are on this call and beyond this call I would love to hear other opinions on this.
Yeah, so would this be a good time for us to just do some brief introductions for the folks that are here? Could we start with, I'm going to go down what I see visually. Amy, could you go first?
Sure. Am I on? Can you guys hear me? Okay. So I'm Amy Collier. I am Associate Provost for Digital Learning at Middlebury College. And I mostly just wanted to join the conversation because this is a topic that's been kind of front of mind. It's not necessarily a conversation that we're having at Middlebury yet, but it's one that we are hoping to start or to push further.
Chris.
Yeah, I'm Chris Gilliard. I am always here to learn and throw the occasional. I don't know if it's appropriate to use this term, but throw the occasional bomb. Mostly, I'm concerned with questions of student rights agency and data privacy.
Thanks, Chris. Chuck.
Chuck Pearson, Associate Professor in Natural Science, Tusculum College, Greenville, Tennessee. Geek at large. That is a very apt description of my interests in this conversation. Just I go all over the map, and I don't know if I throw bombs like Chris, but I leave monkey wrenches behind in the engine.
Thanks, George.
Hi, I'm George Station. I am a lecturer at Cal State Monterey Bay, and I teach a first-year seminar with the theme of technology and society. So basically everything that this network and extended network talk about is always of interest to me. In this case, I think I want to, this is one of the rare occasions I want to clarify that this is about IT policy and things like that. So I do not speak for the university, even though I think I know what the university would say if they were on this call. But I want to, be blunt that I'm representing. I mean, I'll go as far as say I represent some faculty viewpoints, but also I'm here to advocate for students and for everyone who in our, let's say our current outdated policies are called things like users, because a while back it's hit me that I don't want to be called a user, I don't want to be called a consumer, and now we're talking about citizenship. And so that's, maybe one of the things we can get into later as we're talking about making our policies more about individuals and their security and their privacy and so on, as opposed to what is simply good for the institution that happens to have a bunch of people coming and going.
Thanks, George. Hey, Hugh.
Hi, I'm Hugh Kulik. I teach alongside Chris at Macomb Community College near Detroit. And I think my interest is in the connection between class and institutional type. Is it an R1? Is it a M3? What is it? And the policies that govern acceptable use and privacy. That's the thing I think Chris and I have worked on. We've tracked some of that stuff down, and the huge differences in those policies kind of remind us about some of the old things we already knew about class, but we see them being enacted in new ways.
Yeah, thank you. And Daniel is there with Sunday. Do you mind introducing?
I'm Daniel Lyons, or Lyns. I'm an instructional designer at Davidson College, and I love all the datas. So I look at data in a bunch of different ways. And as Kristen was alluding to, we're starting to look at some of these questions a little more deeply at the college here. So I will be involved in those efforts in some way, I am sure.
Thanks, Daniel. And I think Autumn just joined us. Hey, Autumn, do you mind introducing real quick?
Hey guys, I'm Autumn Keynes. I am the Associate Director of Academic Technology at Capital University in Columbus, Ohio. I'm also the co-director of Virtually Connecting, and I do this DigSiz thing every once in a while. It's great to be here with y'all.
Yeah, you're sort of famous.
So no.
So I'll just start. So I don't hear a whole lot of IT people in the crowd here. I think I might be the most IT, maybe Bill's probably more IT than I am. But I'm wondering from your different institutional perspectives, you know, Amy, you mentioned that you really want this conversation to be happening at Middlebury. It is starting to happen at Davidson, and I think a lot of that is driven by, again, by the work that Ken Lane has done and the folks at BYU really getting us to think about things differently. Why do you think your institutions maybe, George, you sort of alluded to this, why is this not happening at your institutions? How do you think we could start these conversations?
I'll jump in if it's okay. Since you mentioned my name, I didn't know if Amy was going to jump in. But what strikes me in these things and in EDUCAUSE articles and so on is that, and especially, let's see, I think, let's see, Hugh maybe mentioned acceptable use and so on, is that these are, by and large, at least in our system, they're very old policies that bring another view of what IT is supposed to be about in the higher ed environment. And so much has evolved. We don't even have, for example, on my campus, and I think it's okay that we don't because of our understanding, but we don't have a social media policy, right? We've got social media guidelines, but there's no policy, right? And there's a big difference in higher ed on a campus between having guidelines about something and having a policy that's made it through our academic senate and been signed by the president and all of that. But with acceptable use, I did a quick search in the few minutes I had earlier and realized that the word citizenship is in our acceptable use policy in one spot, and it's actually in the addendum, which has all the details about stuff that people on campus aren't supposed to do, right? That kind of thing. And it's about, you know, our good network citizenship, and it is about not spamming. It's about bulk email, and that's the only mention of the word citizen anywhere. So I just wanted to kind of tie it back to our overall topic of digital citizenship in that way and say there seems to be kind of a gap between what we always thought of as IT policy and the other end of the spectrum, if you will. You know, and that's kind of where it sits. And our IT folks know that the policy, you know, it's like time for a review. It gets what is called a quick review, but it's kind of cursory every like 5 to 10 years. And the last one was in 2012. And if we stay on track, it won't get looked at again until 2022, right? And obviously everybody here knows that's not going to cut it for the world that we're in. The world's just going to flow around us if we don't try something else. So that's why I'm looking forward to you know, what comes out of this conversation. And I'm, you know, hoping maybe to share this back to our campus as well. You know, again, it's just maybe a door opener just to see what happens.
Yeah, I'll again, speaking from the IT side of the house, I've been in IT since the mid-90s. And this orientation, thinking about individuals first and your business or your institution second, is just not the norm. So I think it's a habit. You know, we're used to protecting systems. We're used to protecting information. We're not used to empowering individuals, at least not in the way that I think people like Amy and others are thinking about now. So I'm not sure how to get there. I don't think it's going to come natural to most folks. So, the way we're thinking about it at Davidson is really trying to place the IT department at the head of driving digital transformation, and instead of supporting, doing the plumbing, all those things that we do behind the scenes, actually taking the lead in helping people become more what we're calling dexterous, digitally dexterous, and also looking at how to reimagine digital spaces, digital technologies, to really go at the core mission of the institution, which is teaching and learning, which is individuals, which is education. So that's different, and I think we'll get there. It's just not something that we're used to doing. We're used to doing exactly what you just described, George, which is all the things you're not supposed to do so that we can protect our systems and our data. And so I don't know. I don't know what is it a reframing of the questions? The reason I pick on the EDUCAUSE top 10 list is because it feels to me very old school in the way it's designed and the way we're thinking about the top 10 issues. We're thinking about the issues that impact our IT operation. We're not, for example, thinking about the issues that impact higher education or the issues that impact learners, and what is our role in addressing those issues, not what is our role in addressing the issues of our systems and our policies. So yeah, again, I don't know how to get there, but I am curious to hear from Amy if she has any thoughts on that whole critical practice with instructional design. It seems to come natural to that field, but I don't think it comes natural to IT, and I'm not sure how to make that leap.
I wouldn't necessarily say that it doesn't come natural so much as it just, it's not what people expect IT to do. It's not the typical way we've wanted IT to work. And I think, I don't have any actual facts to back this up, but I feel like, a lot of, IT's role in higher education institutions kind of came about through administrative systems first. And so the control and compliance piece of IT made more sense because it wasn't really tied to learning. It wasn't really tied to the technology systems that we now think of in terms of student learning. And so when that shift started to happen, what ended up happening in a lot of institutions, and I think this may be true for many of our institutions, is we created a separate thing. We created academic technology groups or educational technology groups or centers for teaching and learning and research and technology, or whatever you want to call it. We created new groups that were to handle that, where technology touched teaching and where it touched students. And I think those people operated differently in some ways than the way we expected IT to operate. And the question I have is, if that's the institution that we're in, say, like Middlebury in many ways has an ITS and it has digital learning group, how do we have conversations across those groups that are informing systems, policies, et cetera, but that are also kind of founded in what we believe about our role relative to students? And that's, I think the question I would love for us to talk through a little bit more. And, I'll say, maybe later some of the things that have kind of sort of worked here, but I'm really interested to hear from other people.
This is really smart because I haven't done a whole lot of thinking through how we get our IT systems on our individual campuses the way we do, except at one institution I was at previously, which will remain nameless, that when they started to develop online education, rather than be very intentional about developing their own IT, they entered into a contract with some outfit called the Apollo Group. Just that Phoenixization of the academic learning piece just jumped in with what that firm was doing and didn't really give the institution a lot of the infrastructure that they needed. So what Amy stirs in my head is how have our academic IT structures come into existence from word go, and how much intention was behind it and how much just happened to fall into place because of circumstances. So Bill, you got something?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think about, and you know, because I hear people talking about, you know, how policies come into existence, how there are different silos that do different things. George, what you were talking about with the next review happening in 2022 with the one prior happening in 2012, like, seems like there are two things at play here. One is kind of unclear mechanisms about when a policy should be revisited, but second also is no real way for student voice to be involved in actually informing what policies should look like when they are revised. So I guess my question is, what mechanisms can IT put in place to make sure that actually, as policies are necessarily getting revised, which, to state the obvious, should probably happen more than once a decade, student voice is centered in those conversations and has an invited, well-defined seat at the table?
Yeah, if I can chime in on that. Right now, Chris and me and another faculty member have been, what is it, Chris, 3 years trying to get the acceptable use policy revised. And the sticking point is whether or not you can refer to IT at the school as an IT environment that's inhabited by co-equal groups, administration, faculty, and students. And there's the usual stuff where they want a list of prohibitions. We want a list of things that you can make happen. But that business of whether or not students actually ought to have a voice and to make evident what they do and don't have in terms of technology, how they are thinking about technology and might learn to do differently. That seems to reflect, again, the type of institution we're at, because community colleges with 50% of the college students in the country are devoted to training people for existing jobs in the industry. So like you say, the model is, what are the restraints on technology? What's the restraints on access? What's the restraints on security and privacy and stuff that fly in a business? And then they just naturally show up at our kind of place, which is half of the college students in the country.
Yeah, agreed. I was wondering if Chris wouldn't mind expanding on the faculty role in that. We just heard the student voice, and Chris, you mentioned that ceding of power to the technical experts away from the faculty as well. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I'm grateful for being in some of these circles is talking to people like you, Kristen, but who I tend to think are exceptional based in terms of how you think about this stuff, based on my experience with my own institution and talking to people at other institutions. Well, I'll put it this way. So I think the unfortunate thing is that a lot of times teachers, professors, instructors are either unable or unwilling to sort of get their hands dirty in terms of understanding technology, at least to the extent to know what the issues are and to know how they affect students and teaching and pedagogy. And what you get, when, I mentioned earlier in the comments that a lot of people who run networks or who are in charge of networks at schools operate from a position of maximum safety and minimum risk. Now that's a fine metric for protecting things. It doesn't work so well in terms of pedagogy. So if we, and so in a lot of the talks I've gone to where technology people are there, people who are in charge of some form or another of tech at the institution, and I'm there preaching about openness and not digital redlining people, and they always say, hey, hold on, we've got to be safe, right? And I'm definitely not saying that, but I think that there's something between maximum safety, minimum risk, and Wild West. And when we only have a certain segment of that environment making those decisions, then it tends to lean towards maximum safety, minimum risk than anything else.
One of the reasons I think Bill and Chris especially are so valuable people to listen to in these conversations is because of the extent to which that both of them value student voice in the application of our technologies. We've seen just in some of the flotsam and jetsam that's turned up in the Chronicle of Higher Education, I won't mention any specific things, but we've seen that much of our universe exists from a perspective of distrusting the people who we're put in charge of education. We don't believe our students as a rule. And how do we turn our institutions, while not, as Chris said, just releasing the Wild West, how do we transition our institutions to the point where we actively listen to that student voice and privilege that student voice to a reasonable extent in making these IT decisions to the benefit of their pedagogy?
Yeah, I agree, Chuck, and I think it's short-sighted on the IT side of the house not to want those voices. I think the reason the voices aren't there most of the time is there's probably a fear that there isn't enough knowledge, I guess, to Chris's point about not engaging and understanding the technology. But that's where we could become much more secure if we played a part in educating the student body and educating faculty and staff on these concepts. Then we'd welcome the voices, and it would make, I really think our environments would be much more secure if we had an educated, a technically educated.
And I think it's important to state that I won't speak for everybody else's experience. I'm just speaking from mine. We consistently underestimate the capacities of our students, not in the sense that they're digital natives or anything special like that, but they're tremendously intuitive. That's not the right word. They can find their way around systems. They don't know what they can't do, is a general rule. They find ways to explore in fashions that we don't tend to think of. So take that point for what it's worth.
So in terms of digital citizenship, I think that this is such an important place for us to think of in terms of, that's what we're doing at our institutions, right? We're creating people that are going to go out and be a part of the world, and that we want to, be active. And the fact that we are, we're gathering a lot of data on our students simultaneously while we're, not having policies that are really clear about what it is that we're doing with it. And so yeah, I think that there's a real opportunity to really bake this into a mission and make this a point of pride of an institution that, when you go out into the world, you're probably going to get a job where they're going to track you, they're going to have data, they're going to, gather data on you. And if you use the internet at all, then, that's already happening for you. So in what ways, what's possible? And once you graduate from here and you leave, in what ways might people be taking your data that you're not going to be able to see? And can we be more transparent? And maybe let students learn about these kind of environments with their own data. So I'll just throw that out and let somebody else jump in.
Well, Autumn's question kind of dovetails with some stuff that I've been thinking about. And again, I think I'm the only person on this call who's not I'm not in a university every day or a college every day. But I guess my question is, the things that Autumn just threw out these are exactly the right questions. And I guess my question is, how many faculty actually understand these points well enough to advocate effectively in any way, shape, or form?
Oh, can I answer?
Can I answer?
That's a
Let
great
me, let
question.
me,
That's a
let
great
me,
question.
Let me, Chris.
Go, Chris.
No, go ahead, you.
Oh, for those of you who love depressing numbers, when our AUP came out, which gave all sorts of bizarre rights to wipe personal devices and block, it was just an atrocity. It went out to all of the faculty. We have about 280 faculty, and a grand total of, let everybody guess, but it would take too much time, 3 people. 3 people objected to it. That's Chris and me and Mary Reagan, who are the ones who are rewriting the AUP. I think it's really hard to get certain types of faculty to see that this matters, because they see their job as preparing students. They see themselves as sort of a corporate job training place. And so these things that interfere with the student's agency and stuff, you know, it's like, good experience. This is what it's going to be like in the real world. Suck it up, get used to it. And you know, it's a really tough sell in some environments. Three.
I just wanted to jump in and say, I think there's a whole bunch of kind of complex forces at work, especially in the higher ed region, where, you know, we look to IT, or a lot of people look to IT to give us like a set of best practices of how to do this and this and this, and therefore I get this thing. Whereas then we're looking at education and how we can't break, I mean, we can break down things into objectives and say student will be able to do this, this, and this, but a lot of the time we know it's a lot more complex kind of look at those things. Then on top of those 2 things, we pile data and all the different points that we can collect data. So for me, a few years ago, I saw Dave Cormier present on something around this, and his big catchphrase was embracing uncertainty. And that's kind of where, that's how I work, is I always just kind of think, okay, things are going to be nuts. Like things are really hard and difficult. And I don't have like, you know, answer A all the time, because there's just so many layers of forces at work. And then we're dealing with policies where all these things take so much time to get people's eyes on documents and to get this committee to see this thing and that thing. I mean, it's overwhelming at times when you try to get something done, and you've got to get through all of those layers of tradition and all those things. That doesn't help at all, I know. I'm just throwing it out there.
Another, I think, huge pressure on all of us is the accreditation process. And I mean, it's the thing that's always lurking there. We know it's coming up every 10 years or however often you get approved. And, you know, the HLC wants data-driven information, and their idea of data, like you say, doesn't really reflect the uncertainties and so forth of actual classrooms and learning and so forth.
Another thing, a lot of these questions about technology and who should know what and what it means to be a citizen in that world, they run along the lines of what we hear often as writing teachers, right? So that people say, well, you know, you send those students, they don't know how to write, yeah. But they never do any practices in their own courses that are would make their students better writers. So to the extent that you write in a course, that course is a writing course. To the extent that you use technology in a class, that class is a tech class.
Yep.
Right? And so I'm loath to bash my colleagues. That doesn't mean I won't, but I think that I mean, I've spent the better part of 2 years going around the country talking about this stuff. There's a lot that people need to learn. I mean, just about sort of basic things about how networks function, how the web functions, to what extent, you know, what you're signing students up for when you use tech in your, you know, particular technologies in your class. And Danny, you're right. I mean, it's extremely complex and difficult. But to answer Bill's question, in my estimation, the degree of knowledge people have just to know enough about when something is fishy is very low, right? I mean, we just need, like, a lot of people just need to get to the point. So when someone says to you, something about tech, like about how tech functions. Like you can just say, well, I know that's not true, right? Or I know enough to know that's fishy, and maybe I can do some research or ask someone else, things like that. But there's I mean, using my own institution as an example, I mean, IT regularly tells people things that are blatantly false, but they are misrepresentations that would make the job of IT easier. And so that's what happens. And I don't think my guy is particularly unethical. I mean, I would imagine that this happens at institutions across the country.
Well, knowledge is power, right? And if you know the way something works and it's going to make your job harder, maybe I just say, well, it doesn't work that way.
I think this is one of the tensions that I've felt around the Domain of One's Own initiative at Middlebury, is that, you know, in part what we're trying to do is give students, faculty, and staff, you know, kind of a chance to play the role of an IT person, right? You're your own sysadmin, your own network administrator, the ability to kind of pick up on those tools and understand how to protect your domain and how to, it's not just about building your identity, which is, I think, is how it's typically it's framed, or build your portfolio. Those are all good things. But I think it's also about developing skill sets that you would kind of typically associate with IT folk. And it's also one of the situations where some IT folks, maybe here at this institution, maybe not, get a little creaky about Domain of One's Own because it does put them in that tension of, well, if a student is doing this kind of work, does it push back against the things that I believe about how IT is run? Does it start to question, you know, put into question some of the policies and the ways that we operate and the systems that we use? So I actually really value that Domains brings up those kinds of questions here, but it also means that there are a lot of hard conversations that happen here as a result of Domain of One's Own. One happens to be happening right now, so. Yeah,
one that
I'm not actually part of. Isn't that funny? I'm here.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, Amy, what you just described, because that was the value to me of Domain of One's Own, is it does force us to question our assumptions about the way we're doing IT, hopefully in ways that help us redesign it in a way that would be interesting to the institution. So I'm wondering why the resistance, I guess. What are the IT folks, in your experience, afraid of happening? Why are they twitchy?
I am super hesitant to answer this on a live Google Hangout. But I would ultimately say that, yeah. How about other people?
Yeah, let me jump in.
I'll get in the queue after Chris.
Yeah, I mean, again, what I would go back to, I mean, first of all, people, if they feel like there's some encroachment on their territory, you know, academia is notorious for you know, that being a huge battleground. But again, I think it comes from the perspective of, you know, maximum safety, minimum risk, right? So that when we get in there and say, well, students should be able to do this and faculty should have a say on that, like what I imagine IT people see is like leaving doors open and windows unlocked and your wallet hanging out of your pocket with cash falling out. You know, I imagine that, you know, that's their metaphor, right? That they think that to change the way they do things, or to even think about it differently, compromises the safety of the institution and the network, and then ultimately they're going to be held responsible for that. You know, I mean, one of the difficulties I have always is that I have no problem saying, this is totally arrogant, but I'll say it anyway. I have no problem saying that I know more about certain things than anybody else at my institution. There are things that people at my institution know way more about than I do. But so like I'm the pedagogical expert. And so when we have tech people making pedagogical decisions without input from pedagogical experts, that's a problem, and it's a detriment to the students. Like, it just can't be. And I think for too long, that's been the accepted practice. And so now that people are sort of pitching these incursions into their fields, into other fields, or into the safety of the institution or the IT network or environment, it causes huge problems and stress.
But one other thing here too is, there are times when actually when IT concerns are actually very real and valid. And that's where, depending on how hardware is set up or on how a system is set up, if somebody forgets to apply updates for 6 months, like, that's going to be a potential security issue. But I think where I've often seen these things break down is actually in the conversations that explain why. And this is where I think it's a lot easier for people to retreat to their turf than it is to actually converse. And this is where, a lot of the technology on a lot of these things is actually sometimes the easiest part. But navigating the egos of the people involved is where it really gets thorny. So we have, I think, carbon-based issues that manifest as technical policies, which is where things start to get south.
Okay. I kind of want to bring it back to it's feeling a little us and them, even though us and them are here as far as IT and everybody else. So I want to make my comment more about all of us, if you will, and because I want to include people in IT as struggling with all this stuff we're talking about, and not just Kristen because she's in the hangout, but like all IT everywhere, right? We've got this change going on around us that a lot of us don't want to deal with. We're in a nice, friendly group that has a lot of people who are willing to discuss this at length and tackle it and experiment with it and so on. But as we all know, we've got a lot of colleagues across all our disciplines and staff, faculty, administrators, and so on, who maybe don't because they're still thinking in previous centuries terms or whatever, right? So that includes IT people, but it's also everybody in all of our disciplines and so on, right? And so what I want to kind of throw out there really is I started reading Kevin Kelly's new book, The Inevitable, and it was so familiar to me that it just seemed to kind of spark and connect with the conversation here. Early in the book, he talks about newbies, and I want to give you a couple of sentences, then I'll stop. But he says that basically all of us, every one of us, will be endless newbies in the future, simply trying to keep up. And here's why. First, most of the important technologies that will dominate life 30 years from now have not yet been invented. So naturally, you'll be a newbie to them. Second, because the new technology requires endless upgrades, you will remain in the newbie state. And third, because the cycle of obsolescence is accelerating, the average lifespan of a phone app is a mere 30 days. You won't have time to master anything before it is displaced, so you will remain in the newbie mode forever. And he describes it as the default for everyone, regardless of age or experience. And Kevin is about my age, so I'm feeling his pain in a certain sense because of the way he describes the issues are hitting home for me. But I think I see that in people a generation either direction from me, if you will. People who just, we're feeling that endless newbiness. I think somebody earlier mentioned, like Dave Cormier and that uncertainty term. And let's see, somebody says perpetual beta. I want to say Harold Jark, is it? Jark? Jarche. And myself say unremitting beta, because that's the world we're in, but we act like our policies are going to be good for 10 years. and that's not just about IT. That's kind of across the board. And our students are arriving not expecting any of that and just showing up with or without their devices and jumping onto our networks. And it's all supposed to make sense. So I just wanted to put that out there, that endless newbiness, as maybe a potential issue for us to discuss. You know, what kind of citizens do we need to be in a world of endless newbiness?
Yeah, George, this is great. It's actually a perfect opportunity for me to introduce Gina from Bryn Mawr, who just joined us a little bit late. But she was posting some great stuff in the chat room about this, in the chat space. And Gina, just to get you up to speed a little bit, we were having conversations earlier about how to engage more people across the campus in these technology conversations, so that it's not this power play of IT deciding for everybody how we should, you know, how our policies and systems should run, but engaging the whole community into different ways of thinking about designs of systems and policies. Do you want to introduce yourself really briefly and expand on what you just said in the chat space?
Sure, I'm so happy to be with everyone, and sorry to be running late. At Bryn Mawr, I'm in the CIO and Director of Libraries role. I come from a humanities background, PhD in English, and got into technology by way of teaching initially. And one thought about this topic is what I tend to do on campus to sort of preach humility is to talk about how there was a time, you know, maybe up through the 80s and early 90s, where higher ed was the place that you went to have access to the like leading edge technology, you know, big computers and fast networks and snazzy experimental stuff. And since, you know, the early 90s, I would say we are on this different kind of curve where the rest of the world is accelerating, and we say, hey, students, come here and go back to the 80s with our stodgy technology, you know? And the more we start to be permeable and help people to select the thing that they would use anyway, not the thing that we on our campus have blessed as the, you know, the only supported thing, I think the better off we are. And I couldn't agree more that we're all in that boat. Even if you grew up thinking you were comfortable with technology, that keeps evolving and it'll keep, you know, being different than anything we can imagine. And so I think being very open to the intellectual play of not knowing and being in a space of discovery, I think is really important. And on our campus, faculty have been very open to that kind of, you know, intellectual engagement with how our world is shifting. Students, where we've created forums, we don't create enough of them, I think, but students tend to like being in the mix of those conversations and thinking about how do I go be a person, you know, in the world, and what are the considerations. And I think staff, like all humans, you're right, it's kind of a mix of the folks who are kind of continuously learning and stretching, and the folks who are wanting it to be done the way that we want it to be done and that's familiar. But I'm so glad I jumped in on this conversation. Sounds like a great thread.
Yeah, one thing I would add, George, and thanks, Gina. I mean, although the technology often changes, the questions about it do not change, or they don't change quite as much as the tech. You know, how do we continue to make things the most fair, the most just, the most open, the most safe?
Yeah.
That hasn't changed in hundreds of years. I mean, and so as long as we're asking those questions, I think we can do a lot of great things. But when we default to just how do we make them the most safe, you know, or the least dangerous, or we don't ask, you know, the questions about safety and justice and fairness, I think that's where we run into a lot of problems. Yeah, not how can we make the most money with them. That also hasn't changed, but I wish it would.
Yeah, and Gina, I think, you know, you and I are the IT people, I think, in this group primarily. The questions we were grappling with is, you know, why aren't we as IT organizations engaging in those kinds of questions, the ones that Chris just presented so eloquently? Why aren't we engaging in those more with our campuses, in our acceptable use policies, in, you know, whatever it is we're designing for our systems? What are the things that hold us back from that? We've talked about things like accreditation and auditing, but I'm curious from a CIO's perspective what you think.
I think it's a like cultural bias and then cultural change questions. I think, you know, I've been in a number of different places. I think when I landed here, the caste system was extraordinarily clear, and that was that staff are meant to respond and support, not to think with you. And so IT had become very commodified. I can show you how to use the discussion forum, but I can't talk with you about why you might want to have online discussion. And so I think a lot of the shift we've been making is sort of let's not waste all of the capability that are in the humans that are here in the community, and let's prepare ourselves to be good listeners, good partners, good collaborators. So I think that's a large part. And then there was another cultural moment here before I got here that was faculty should be able, and the should is always like a good red flag, should be able to just do everything for themselves, and staff should just be able to learn everything by themselves. So all of a sudden there was this retreat of there's not going to be anyone helping you. You're going to just go sort it out on your own, which was crazy. You know, so I think a lot of it is just what are the cultural belief systems and how do those play out in terms of how we team up with each other or not.
And I'll just add to that really quickly that I think our professional organizations haven't really helped us in this way as IT or educational technology folks. You don't go to an EDUCAUSE conference and see enduring questions of social justice in technology as a session. You see optimizing your network for blah, 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 blah. And that is what it is, but it is something where the culture runs deeper than just our institutional contexts in this case. We're working with a lot here beyond our institutions, or working against a lot.
Sorry, I just want to bring up something that Kristen had talked about a while back, and I think it kind of fits in here in terms of that idea of what's behind a system, and does that system need to think about people, and not just IT systems, but the software companies that we work with and the platforms that we work with. And as institutions, having a set of things that we expect that are based in social justice issues, really, and human rights as the first set of things that we talk about with those groups. And if we could do that with software as well, then maybe our IT at our institutions would fall in line as well, or be more apt to have these conversations. So I see it, you know, that systems thing both in our institutions, but also in the commercial world that we have to deal with as people who work in educational technology in some way, in education and technology and where they come together. There's that capitalist thing that we can't ignore as well. So I'm just wondering where people see that piece of this as well.
I mean,
I'm sorry, Bill. I'm getting super eager. No, go ahead, Bill.
Well, I mean, the place to start digging that out is the privacy policies and the terms of service and the data use agreements on all third-party vendors. Because if you want to get a clear sense of what an organization's or what a company's business plan is, and how it pertains to information that's collected as a part of that business, look at their policies, because that's where they carve it out. And, you know, and that's where, you know, again, I mean, you know, if you look at a company like Turnitin and you see what ownership rights they claim over data that's submitted to their system, you can learn a lot about what their business strategy is and where they perceive their value and where they perceive the value of the students who are forced to work within that system. So this is where I think developing a sense of, and really a common language among practitioners about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable for a vendor to disclose or a vendor to not disclose. Again, I mean, this is well-worn ground. The Fair Information Practices and Principles covers a lot of this. But I think having a greater awareness of what, because I mean, if a vendor says they're going to do X, like we actually have an obligation to believe them. They're telling us this, and we should listen. So I think having that as a starting point to determine what use of a service means for the people who are forced to interact in it is one way to frame the conversation.
Here's another example building on what Bill's saying, which I really wholeheartedly agree with. And that is, so many, and this is a more controversial one, I'm going to go out a little bit on a limb. So many institutions are adopting Canvas as their LMS. And they're doing it because it's quote unquote open source and because it has a friendly interface. It's also built by people who are Mormon and therefore I assume tithe and therefore are supporting anti-LGBT initiatives across the country. I wouldn't adopt them, right? And that's a different kind of political decision. So I have nothing against Mormons, but the practices of where those dollars go is against what our institution stands for. And folks are not doing that analysis at all.
Yeah, I think these points are really important. I'm sorry, Hugh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I mean, you know, I've talked with a lot of people on this panel about Turnitin and the, you know, the difficulties of, you know, how your position at a college or university determines whether or not you can tell people that Turnitin sucks and they shouldn't use it. You know, and having gone to OLC, you know, and written about the, you know, it being sponsored by oh gosh, what do they call that stuff? Like by Proctor software and anti-cheating software and platforms and things like that. I mean, but to go back to what Sunday was talking about, I think the thing I'm really hung up on right now, and that I think is really important, is when we talk about, I mean, there's two things I think are really important to get out there, and I try to do as much as possible. One is Zubov's notions of surveillance capitalism, but also the notion of platforms as extractive. And what I mean by that is that so much of the web, with the way we use it, or the way what the web has come to mean, is that like they, you know, things on the web take your data and monetize it, or they take it and hold on to it until they can figure out how to monetize it. To the extent that we at colleges and universities adopt that strategy, like we are endorsing and promoting and forwarding that practice, which is inherently unjust. So all these things we do, we need to interrogate. And again, like if a vendor's sponsoring a conference, I mean, they're paying for the conference, but what they're ultimately trying to do is get you to buy their product. So, you know, I'm not the one to necessarily promote consumer as activist models. But, you know, there's something to think about there. Like why are we having conferences sponsored by technologies whose main goal is to cast students as cheaters?
I think one of the things Chris and I have seen is the level of detail that's required to get control of what happens with third-party information. We just got the third-party policies from 14 major airlines, and those policies about what you can do with third-party data, and you know, they're the capitalists, they're the ones who know how to play hardball. It's a 16-page document, you know, and at our school there is no policy about anything to do with third parties. And if we're going to resist these, I mean, let's be blunt, these capitalist forces, we've got to play exactly the same game. We have to make policies and so forth be as detailed and as restrictive as we can to fit what we want for our students. But I think it's a massive kind of task that most of us, I mean, we wouldn't know where to begin.
Well, I mean, one of the, Hugh, you mentioned third-party policies. I mean, it's worth pointing out that I think the single largest data breach that we've seen in U.S. history, which I'm sorry, it's a leak, not a breach, but you know, the voter information of 200 million Americans was exposed for 12 days by a third party who had access to the data.
Yeah.
And it looks like this was exposed unencrypted. This is where on the university side, and it kind of gets back to one of the original questions that we were talking about, you know, I would argue at the very least, if we are requiring students to interact within a system, we know where information is going. And I'd say we also have a requirement to be able to articulate not who owns the data, but who can access the data. Because with a lot of data use, access trumps ownership. And you know, same thing. I mean, if my neighbor buys a car, but I can use it anytime I want, it doesn't really matter that I don't own the car. Like, I can drive anywhere. So this is really poorly understood. And if you look at actually the terms of most vendors out there, if they even go so far as to list their third parties, which most don't, they don't actually describe any restrictions on how those third parties can use data or access data. They really don't describe how these third parties can augment or recombine data against other sources, which is where it can get really thorny. And this gets to what, you know, Chris was talking about some of these platforms as extractive, and really as a gateway to further incursions against a learner's future agency. So these are all things that often do not get considered at the point where a service is brought in for use, which ultimately disadvantage learners for years after their interaction within the organization.
Here's to play a little bit of, it's not devil's advocate exactly, but here we are in Google world using their free tool because it's convenient to us. They're one of the most extractive corporations in the nation. So one thing I would say is, like, there's no way to be pure. I think, what can we do to intervene in meaningful ways? But we all make these trade-offs for personalization and convenience. You know?
And I just think that we need to talk with students about it, you know? And I mean, you're gonna do it, but don't do it blindly. Don't do it out of ignorance. Do it and understand the trade-off. And I just feel like that's, if we're gonna be in higher education, if we're gonna be working with students and preparing them to go out into the world, we need to be talking about those kind of things and wake them up to those realities.
Yeah, I mean, I am under no illusions. I mean, I use Gmail. You know, to the extent that someone can know how bad Google is, I know. But the problem is that people do it to their students. And they do it either with no awareness of them for themselves, and then they foist that upon their students, or, you know, even worse, they know and foist it upon their students. You know, to round it back to questions of citizenship, I think that we can't, I think it's inherently unjust to enlist people in ways that they didn't have any say in, you know, or that without giving them as much knowledge as we have the ability to give them, you know. So, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Gina.
I was just going to say, and alternatives, ideally, like that you can opt out legitimately and have another path.
Yeah, because I mean, Hugh and I, you know, we've seen some horrible things. I mean, I brought this example up a bunch of times, but I had a student whose a professor wanted them to link their LinkedIn to their Facebook account for class, and she was going to be punished in her grade if she did not do this. So, like, you know, like if a student uses Facebook right on their own, like that's one thing, you know, but I mean, the way everyone's not shaking their head indicates that they know, you know, how bad that is. But, you know, again, it's not an isolated event. I mean, that's happening all over the country in classrooms all the time.
So now I'm back to the question about the role of the faculty-staff relationship, right? And as a staff member who isn't eligible for tenure and who isn't, I do adjunct teach, but that's kind of like a side gig, and that's very new for me, especially when I first started. And I started in IT. Now I'm in a Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, but I started as an IT person. I came in with a mindset and a culture within myself of I'm going to advocate for faculty and I'm going to advocate for students. I'm going to talk with faculty about the implications as far as I understand them of using certain tools. But I don't know that all IT staff people take that approach. And I think it's got to go both ways. It's got to be the staff person taking that approach, but the faculty member also has to be willing to take that kind of advice from a staff member as well, right? And I actually haven't run into that too much, but I've seen it from afar, and I've heard stories about some faculty members who have been like, what do you know? You're just the IT guy.
Well, I'll say something ugly.
Well, wait, let me stop you, Hugh.
Okay.
I'll give you a better thing.
Okay. Thank you.
Why don't you talk about the time, why don't you talk about our experiences with the Writing Center and discussions about Turnitin?
Oh, don't, because then that's recorded somewhere and I go.
Well, you don't have to name names.
Okay.
Yeah.
Our new Writing Center, which is part of the Center for Teaching and Learning, decided that what they wanted to do was have everyone use Turnitin. Am I correct so far? And I believe I wrote them a letter that said that they might want to think about why students should work for free and provide their creative work to a for-profit company, and why teachers should be involved in something that assumed that it was the student's job to prove they were innocent. And then what happened?
I mean, this gets at some of the tension I think that's being discussed, is that professors come to technologists and say, like, hey, how do I integrate this? And technologists feel, or Writing Center directors or whoever, feel compelled to, because of precarity in their jobs, because, for all kinds of reasons, right? They can't say, like, don't use that, I mean, that's not gonna, doesn't go over well. I mean, so, like, how we find spaces, and, I mean, how we find spaces to have influence about some of these questions, right? I mean, all of us are in positions where somebody might come to us and say, like, we really want to use this tech, and we're not really in a position to say, like, absolutely not. So, like, how do we navigate that?
Yeah, I don't think you should ever be put in that position, right? And maybe I'm a crazy person, but I don't think that, staff people should ever be telling faculty you have to use the technology.
Oh no, but are you able to, conversely though, are you able to say, like, yeah, you shouldn't be using that?
Yeah, you shouldn't be using that. Now I can say I feel comfortable saying I wouldn't use that technology for these ethical reasons. And a lot of times they tell me, well, I don't care about that stuff, but and what do I do at that point? Like, okay.
I think it should be, I mean, I think there's a fundamental opposition between what faculty are up to and what staff are up to. It's not the same job, and that there are just inherent and useful differences in the ends we serve. And to seek to have those all resolved is to lose a lot of the value of, to lose the value of dialectic, or whatever they call it.
Sure.
And so I don't really look to have those things resolved. It's how do you make them public and shared? How do you make the fight visible? And I think that's a more productive thing to do.
I love what you're saying, Hugh, and I wish we had more conversations about that, because I think I agree with you, but we might have different reasons that we think that faculty and staff are up to different things. And I think it would be interesting to see how people think about that.
Yes. Yeah. I would like, I think it would be very interesting to find out what staff think the type of thinking is that faculty do. I think it'd be really useful to know what faculty in general think about what the IT folks do. And I think both groups would feel like they were being horribly misrepresented by the others.
Well, and this is also where, though, I mean, I think a lot of times we try and jump into the conversation without having an adequate understanding of what the baseline is. So, I mean, talking about, it's very difficult to say across the board that tech use is X if we don't actually know what tech is being used and for what.
Right.
So I think a lot of these conversations, there was a, George, you put in the chat, like, could it get started on each of our campuses? I mean, I think one really safe way to do that is to actually ask the question, like, what are we actually using? And what are we using it for? And have that be an internal conversation to start. But this way, it's hard to talk about what normal should be if we don't know what normal is. And this is kind of it's a safe and non-confrontational way to actually get these conversations going.
And I think that's a great place to maybe wrap up here. I know a few people have dropped out and a few people need to go soon, and this could really go on forever. And I really appreciate everyone's time today. But I think that's a good place for us to all leave with the thoughts here and the conversations that could be started in different ways, obviously on all our campuses. Unless there are I'll open it up for last thoughts if people want to share something.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for getting this organized. This is a really enjoyable conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, for being a facilitator this week, and everyone here.
No, and Sunday, thanks for the invite too. I have been kind of out of it because of like real life vacation for a bit, so I missed the start of digital citizenship this year, and so I'm appreciate the chance to jump in here.
Glad to have you, George.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Sunday, for doing the sign-ups and facilitation.
Yeah.
All right, we're stopping our broadcast.